16 and 17. This kind of gives you some background and some context. The concept, we're talking about Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs, and the photograph there will give you a little bit of biography. In 1954, Abraham Maslow, as a American psychologist, developed this model of looking at what we humans need in order to have a great life, so to speak. And this concept is really valuable to interpretation because a lot of times we enter into a situation we don't know who the audience is, or even if we do know who the audience is, it can be a challenge figuring out what do they need and how do we best get information across to them. So if you like, what we're going to do as a group is to go through this process, and you're welcome to fill this side out if you want to do that, or you can also just jot down notes that would apply to your situation and your setting that way. So that's another option that way. So down at the very bottom are physiological needs. What are some, when you think about what basic needs that we might have as people?
Where's the bathroom?
I was just going to do this. You didn't come up with it. That's very common. Restrooms, bathrooms.
Food.
Another one, food, okay.
Safety.
Food. We're going to save safety for a little bit the next rung up.
Water.
Water, okay.
Shelter.
Shelter.
Can you sit or stand?
What was that?
Can you sit or stand?
Sit or stand? Oh, you mean in terms of
Comfort.
comfort, okay. Anything else?
Temperature.
Okay.
Health.
Yes, medical problem.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Actually, we're going to say that just for that next one up here. Anything else?
Being able to breathe.
Okay. So let's look at the next rung up. So these are those basic, air, bathrooms, just the basic human needs. Next one up in terms of safety and security. What are the things what are some things we would do for safety and security with visitors?
Emergency procedures.
What's that?
Emergency procedures, and I
Okay.
don't know where they are.
Okay. So if you've ever been in a meeting with a warehouse employee, it's just fascinating. It's in their DNA as a company to make sure their employees know all the particulars. Like for instance, exits. What do you do in case of an earthquake? Even if they're not in the building that's warehousing. And I've did several different times, at least 3 different employees, they'll raise their hand. Oh, I think we need to talk a little bit about emergency issues in the event something happens. And it's just fascinating as a company that is in their DNA. So it's like exit routes and what happens in an earthquake, what happens in case of fire. Meeting locations, as a group later on. So. Other things about safety and security.
Accessibility.
Okay.
For people with disabilities.
ADA related. Yeah, okay.
Personal belongings.
What was that?
Like, personal belongings.
Personal belongings, okay.
Where do you
Actually, we're
store
gonna
things?
save that for the next one.
If you're interacting with, like, when you touch tanks, or if you have, like, a program animal out, letting them know why it is safe for them to engage with that animal.
Okay.
Or how to do so, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, giving directions, so to speak. Yeah, okay.
I don't know if you know. I meant like your purse or your stuff, not
Okay.
like belonging.
Where to put things, or
Yeah.
that it's gonna be safe?
Yeah.
Okay. And I know that this is small, so you're welcome to come up later and take a look at it.
I would add like stuff, like your, like if you have proper equipment.
Okay.
So like if you're hiking or you're out, do you have proper, shoes? Do you have an umbrella if you need it, or a jacket, or?
Are you prepared for the environment?
Environment.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, especially if you're physically looking at hiking, their feet, what's on their feet and the like. What's interesting with this aspect is I've got a couple of projects I'm working on with wastewater treatment plants and education centers attached to them, and they do tours. And one of the things they want to do in these tours is to have them wear a hard hat. Well, you think about, would you really have the public in a situation situation where you really needed a hard hat, you don't really need a hard hat. But it's more the sense of a transition between anything goes out here and there's restrictions here. So it's an actual prop, so to speak, that they wear along with safety vests to make sure that what their role is different once they pass that gate or whatever it might be.
Tina, do you have hard hats at Boeing?
No, but you cannot bring anything into the factory with you, which is kind of a good thing. No
Oh.
cell phones, no cameras. And this is not just for the safety of the visitors, but the safety and security for our employees.
Sure.
And we are way up over the factory floor, and we don't want anything dropping down, because if you break a plane, you gotta buy it.
No fog.
Well, and that is also too in terms of security, intellectual property. in terms
Yes,
of building it.
yes.
Yeah.
Definitely, yes.
We always had, the venture thing, we always had basically it's a legal contract that people had to sign that says that if they wanted, for the safety of rock climbing or their hiking, they wanted to bring a helmet or they wanted to bring this or that it was their
Their
responsibility and
responsibility.
not us to provide it. And because a lawyer said, oh, you get sued here, you get sued here, you get sued here, so you have to have all these, rules and regulations that people sign,
Yeah.
as well as allowing them, which you had us sign, to use photographs in our advertising. Is it okay?
Right.
And I've only had one person who didn't want to have their picture taken, but we honored it.
Well, and that's connected to what our culture is. I mean,
Yeah.
there's just those kinds of issues are there. Elsewhere in the world, it's like, it's your own
Oh,
responsibility.
other countries, they don't care.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Generally, I think awareness, just being aware of the situation for other people. I mean, in my experience, when people are outside their comfort zone or doing something new, they tend to forget, like, that they're walking into a bike lane, or they tend not to notice that they're
Yeah.
about to get hit by a tram, or that
Yeah.
there's a pickpocket.
That's true.
So you have to think for them
Yeah.
and be aware of, the environment better than they do, and so just anticipate and be aware of what the any
Yeah.
potential danger.
Well, I imagine too the way people take photographs these days.
Yeah.
Mine is along the same lines, like sometimes you need actual training to go to certain places, or if to do a certain hike, for example, like if you're doing a high elevation climb of Mount Rainier up to the top, like
Oh,
you
yeah.
need some sort of,
Yeah, definitely.
some training or,
Orientation.
orientation,
Yeah, right.
exactly.
Okay. So let's move up to the next one. How do we make people feel like they belong? This is actually called love, that's supposed to be a heart, and belonging. How do we make people feel like they belong to the group that they're with on a trip, or on a interpretive activity?
Is it use people's names or learn their names?
Okay. And sometimes that's these things, because it helps us.
Just greeting them and welcoming them to your side.
Okay. I'm glad you said that, because that first 5 or 10 minutes before a program starts is where you really make the connection with people, to get them on your side. If there's anything controversial that occurs later on, if you've had some kind of a connection early on, it makes a world of difference.
Make sure to include the whole group instead of just a select few.
Tell us more about that.
So, like when we take the kids out on the walk, and we ask them questions, and there's almost always like just 1 or 2 people who know the answer to everything, and so just making sure to include all the maybe more shy people within the discussion as well,
Definitely.
instead of just calling on the same 1 or 2 people every time.
Because invariably be that.
Yeah.
Even if they're adults, definitely children do that, but even if they're adults, they'll get into that element. And I'm glad you said that, because it also sometimes means how we physically structure the group. If it's in a situation where people are like this, those people in the front have a tendency to do that anyway, because they can see you. The other thing that drives me crazy outdoors, and I'm sure you've all experienced that, is those long lines, and the last person's there, the first person's there, and the interpreter starts talking. And that person just arrived, and they have no idea what's been said up to that point. Other things.
One thing we do in our tour, we walk through city streets, and so there's times when we have to move over when we're traveling stop to stop, because to let joggers by or something. So we kind of have this like group chant thing, and we practice it a few times, and it's, depending on the tour, it's either heave, and then everybody says ho, and they move to the right, or it's bottoms, and then they scream up, and they move over. But it's kind of unifying, and we give tour guide buttons, and so there's a visual that, hey, we're a part of this group, and we're participating. So it's kind of
really creative. Do you practice that before you even leave?
We do, yes.
So
So
you tell
we're,
them.
when we're in the parking lot,
Yeah.
okay, everybody, let's practice, heave, oh, and then they all move over.
That is great. That, I mean, for one, that also unifies the group,
Yes.
pulls them together. And it also says, hey, we can be silly, but we're gonna be silly as a group.
Oh, yeah, no, I make everybody be silly.
Oh, that's great. That's a great idea.
Thanking them both at the beginning and the end, and acknowledging that their participation is supporting your organization.
Okay. A great way to make a connection back to who you're working for, so to speak.
Introductions in a culturally appropriate way.
So tell us more about that.
So if you know your audience and say you're hosting a group and you know that they're all from a specific place, introduce yourself in a way that is most appropriate. Because there are going to be cultures that are uncomfortable with you looking them directly in the eye and shaking their
Sure.
hand.
Okay. Okay. And do you ever give an explanation of that ahead of time, or do you just do it, so to speak?
For me, it's a little bit different. So, for example, if I'm in a space, it depends on if my audience is native or non-native.
Okay.
So if I'm within my community or a different native community, I know what's appropriate. Like I have to acknowledge
Sure.
the space that I'm in, and I have to acknowledge the elders that are in the room
Okay.
first.
Okay.
So there are different pieces.
And so you would know that because of the audience that you're
Right.
in line,
Mhm.
yeah. In a situation where there's mixed groups, so to speak, do you give an explanation of that, or you just do it and they see you modeling it?
Well, no. Well, yes, they see me modeling it, but I also, it's kind of introductory prep. So if I know I'm going to have a mix, like I find a way to identify the natives in the group, and I typically introduce myself before doing the large group introduction.
Okay.
Or if I'm in the classroom setting and I happen to know that there are identified natives in the group, I sometimes pull them out beforehand because especially when, as Native peoples, we don't have access to a lot of our histories, I want to create a space for them too. So it's a matter of saying, some of the questions that you hear today might be questions that you have or that you feel uncomfortable with, but afterwards we'll have time so that you can ask me directly if you don't feel comfortable asking those questions within the classroom setting.
Okay. So just a quick side note, because that question came up back here in the sense of, if I, as a Caucasian, European-based person was the leader that night, but there were Native people in the audience, what's the most appropriate thing for me to do? And I'm putting you on the spot, I don't mean to.
No, it's fine. And there are a few people in the group who have asked that too, and I think that it depends on what your intentions and the themes are of what interpretation you're going to be doing that evening. So have you specifically invited natives to participate? Because if that's the case, there are certain protocol things that you should take care of.
Okay, that's helpful, because those are those things that if you have relationships with people, Native people, then you know a little bit about that, but if you don't,
Right.
it's like this blank slate.
Right.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Increasingly, I think everybody's going to experience this in any venue that you work in. You're going to see an increase in visitors from China. And China is Boeing's largest customer. And at my venue, what the person is escorting these Chinese visitors, they will dump them on our tour, for the tour, and then they go take a break. Because there's a rule that if you want to interpret for your group, you have to buy out the bus. Well, they don't. So they bring about 20 or 30 people. And I feel so bad for them because at our organization, because there's so many dialects in China, they're not going to create a kind of printed material in their language, and also the restriction of bringing anything into the factory with you. So what we've learned to do is try to help them be introduced to the group as whole. Because Mr. Boeing's first engineer right out of MIT in 1916-17 was Wang Su from China.
Really?
So we announced that to the group, and they recognize that name. They might not understand anything else I'm saying, but they recognize that name because he is famous in China. And so whatever you can do to also help the group, help them belong, even if they don't speak English. but you're gonna see an increase. Have you guys noticed that yet? Increase in Chinese visitors?
Other parts of the world certainly are, and they're
It's
feeling
getting
pretty
out, yeah.
overwhelmed, actually.
I was just telling Jean's husband last night, last September, when I was in Irkutsk on lakes like Baikal, they're actually closer to China than they are any other country. And there's just this huge motor coach type tour groups that are coming through. And just in a year, I noticed a lot more Chinese names on restaurants. So in other words, there'd be the Russian name, and then there'd be the Chinese translation of it already up in neon. I mean, not just a hand sign, but in neon already put in place. So,
I think just adding on to what you said, just asking general questions that everybody can, to putting it out there. Have you been here before? So you're already creating a common context to let them feel maybe they're nervous about being someplace. Okay, I'm not alone here. Other people are in the same boat.
well, you were mentioning before, I think yesterday, about introducing people, it's starting off groups that way, and making sure that people you introduce each other or something like that. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Identifying with them. And I say that because when I worked as a naturalist kayak guide, when you're about to take a group up to kayaking, I started out talking about all the stupid stuff I did. You know, the fact I hated kayaking in the beginning. You may hate this, but I want you to come to. I was scared. So bringing up the feelings, how I felt about the activity, or I need to pee 15 times before I go and get in the kayak. You know, so that they don't feel embarrassed with their hesitancies in experiencing something new, because it was new to me and I understand those feelings. And so it's a way of identifying that I'm not above them. I'm not the expert that that they can't talk to, but there's someone that I can identify with.
Definitely. Well, then it takes that hallowed feeling off of them, and well, if that happened to her, it's okay. I can. Yeah.
Jumping off that, like, I was gonna say, like, just sharing something about yourself to increase that belonging, like, that you're part of the group as well, like she was saying. So like when I used to like lead volunteer groups at like the food bank, and I'd just be like, hey, my name's Jake, I'm not from State Farm, back when that was like a thing. But just like kind of like tell them a little about me. I'm like, I'm from Pittsburgh, or and just kind of so they know who you are, and they can relate to you, or in some way.
That comfort level. Let's move up to esteem. How do we make people feel good about themselves?
Acknowledging relevant questions or comments. So I work with kids on the daily, so whenever they ask a really good question or a really good comment, I ask them to maybe say it louder so the rest of the class has their attention. Or if they're too shy and don't, then I say, oh, such and such asked this or said this. Kind of, saying that was a great comment. Thank you. Some attention on them to make you critically.
Oh, yeah. Good idea.
So our organization has gone through a program quality training. It's really cool if you want to ask about it. It's for youth, but it identifies things that you can do that are just good best practices for any program. And one of the things is non-evaluative feedback. So instead of saying, good job, I like what you did, that was wonderful, you would say something non-evaluative. So I can see you put a lot of time into that. That doesn't say whether it's good or bad, it doesn't evaluate it or anything like that. Or just restating something that somebody said. So just repeating it as if, like you said, like, oh, you had a question, the question was this, but without saying good or bad. Just, that was interesting, or that was, did anybody else feel that way, or giving just moments for feedback that's not got value assigned to it is really helpful, especially for youth.
Well, and I was just thinking about this aspect of things, especially with wrong answers or completely off the board. Like, why don't you think that is what you're going through your head? But that was a great, in terms of recognition and the sense that they contributed. And
yeah.
Would you call it descriptive feedback?
Yeah, non-evaluative is better than descriptive because you don't. Because like we do one with youth where we're woo, and that's feedback. Like you shared that, woo, and kids start recognizing it, and then they'll do it to one another, and it's a little bit like it's positive because I'm smiling while I'm doing it, but it's non-evaluative, so it's just a thing. You acknowledged it, but without value.
So can you see Ben in the front of the Coliseum?
I totally can. Please do
an alliance.
You'd be surprised,
Just good old, see, I have large groups, so eye contact, and at the very end of the tour, we of course have to leave you to the gift shop. But at the gift shop, I shake everyone's hand and, you know, thank them for coming, and through the tour, make sure everyone can hear, children that are, you know, might be trampled in the group, make sure that they're in a position where they can see and hear. So when you have a large group, just trying those small things to make everybody feel like.
And that can be a challenge, just time factor wise, but also just the logistics of such groups. And how does that work with non-English speakers? Is that still do something like that?
Smiling,
Okay.
and, yeah, and, there's so many little things. We hand you a boarding pass before you go on the bus. Certain cultures, you're not supposed to hand, you're supposed to present it to them like that. So we just know to do that, and just little things that we pick up.
Business cards in China and Japan, you present,
Yes.
and you don't take it and put it in your pocket. You
No.
look at it.
You look at it
keep
and you
talking.
acknowledge, yeah. Little things.
Anything else with the STEAM?
Kind of like ties into like maybe the mission of your organization or like acknowledgement, like whether you're like working with volunteers, like you know how important their contribution is, you know, to being able to assist, you know, your organization, or but even just like park visitors at a, you know, here for example, like it gives you guys the opportunity to have a job and whatever, like you know, so just like acknowledging that they're a part of that and you know, and just impressing the importance and you know, kind of ties into the thinking of their time or.
Great, yeah.
Within my community, it's extremely important to humble yourself. So to present yourself as a lifelong learner and say that, you know, you might be more experienced or have more knowledge around this, and if you could help me or add to the conversation, and then acknowledging that when it happens is also a part of it.
So you as the leader of the group asking somebody in the group for their experience, their background, their opinion kind of thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. And then when you open the floor, it essentially gives them, when they feel comfortable to share information, they'll typically say, oh, well, they always kind of lead with their experience. Well, I did this, this, and this, and what I learned was, and then it changes the dynamic of the experience.
So we do a lot of talking around conservation, and one of the things that I have found really, really reaches people is making sure you acknowledge the things that they are already doing, even if they're small.
So tell us more about that. So they're telling you a story of what they do.
Right, so like if you're going to talk about, for example, you're going to talk about, this last summer we talked a lot about plastics in the ocean, and our ultimate goal is to get people to commit to doing new actions that reduce their use of plastic. But they will enter that conversation in a much more positive way and leave it much more likely to make changes if you actually spend time finding things they already do and appreciating the work they've already done to integrate those things, and then just challenge what else could you do.
Because those topics can be just like beaten down after a while. How can we move like that? You should help. Those kinds of things. Yeah.
Something that I'll do, because we deal with a lot of cruise ship passengers, so if I have time before a tour starts, usually we just kind of gather in a group. I don't have a lot of time when they first arrive to really get to know them or ask names. So after I greet them, I'll start asking, so where's everybody from? And acknowledge, okay, sometimes it's just different states. You're from New York, you're from Maine, you're from Florida. Is this your first time to Alaska? Oh, you're from Australia, you're from the UK, whatever it is. And I'll try to draw those connections, because being from California, sometimes, oh, California, oh, whereabouts? That's where I'm from. You know, try to make that connection in that regard, because it's a much different setting when you only have them about 3 minutes before the tour starts, and then they're off of a bus and then back on a bus. So that's something that I personally will try to do before the formal introduction of who I am and what I'm doing there and my background is. I will oftentimes just start chatting with them and ask, how's your cruise going? What was your favorite thing so far? What have you seen? What stop are we on your tour today? That helps me gauge them and also gives them that chance to start talking with me, get to know me a little bit better too.
Well, and you're a different face. They see the same group of people day in and day out
Yeah.
for 10 days, and you're a new person. So
Yeah.
Kind of adding to Nicole's point of humbling yourself, what we do a lot with the kids is that we remind them it's not a zoo, and so we don't none of us, like none of the staff or the volunteers who help out with the field trips know exactly where all the animals are. And so it's their job to help us find all the animals.
Interesting.
So then it kind of, it gets them really excited, and then when they find a bird or if they find a beaver, they just they're really excited to share it with everybody, and it helps them.
You have a different mindset then.
Yeah.
Because there's a different thing of here's the different exhibits that you're gonna go see them versus where are they, and help us find them.
Right.
Neat.
Respect for other lifestyles. The best example I can think of is that at Wolf Haven, of course, we love wolves and we want them to be in the wild, but you may have somebody in your group who is a rancher who hates wolves and wants them all killed, and sometimes they'll challenge you. So what about this? What about that? And just having respect for the fact that they have concerns about their lifestyle and not putting them down, but really acknowledging that that's a valid concern that they have.
Yeah. Differences of opinions and values for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
Because it gets political even.
Oh, yeah, I
like
can imagine.
Republican, Democrat, and all
I
kinds
can
of stuff.
imagine.
Yeah.
Yep. Blue, red, and purple.
I was just gonna add to what you were saying. That I was just on a tour with a local guide in Thailand, and one of the things that she did that was so effective, she asked people where they were from, and she knew something about every place. Like some random fact she knew, like about a country, about what the capital was, about like Seattle. She knew like the Supersonics. Well, you're 10 years late for that, but still, it was so impressive, and she did it with the whole group. So just by having a kind of weird random knowledge, it helped me say, you've taken the time, you're a curious person, and already you can identify something about me, and it made me already that much more engaged with her. And I thought it was really an effective thing, and you know, people can apply that differently, but
Yeah.
it just shows an interest in a humility, I guess.
Plus, she's got good memory.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think helps in when I was doing it, because I don't feel like I'm an expert in anything. So I would say that I'm a naturalist. A naturalist knows a little bit about everything, but not a whole lot about anything. And so if you have a question and I don't have the answer, I'll help you find it. We have a good library. I'll go find it, and I'll hold that question, and I will go research it for you if you need help in doing that. And often they go, I point them to the library, they come back later and say, oh, did you know that the oldest eagle was 39 when he died? And then I'd share that with the whole group. Hey, we found out this in answer to their question. And so we all became learners.
Well, the nice thing for your experiences too is it's just like Ben and several others, if you have people in several days in a row, you can see that provocation, as we mentioned yesterday, and that kind of connection that they took the initiative to do that and acknowledge it.
And I also engaged one young woman that had an interest in it. She wanted to help ID things. And so I gave her the books, and then she'd start pointing out things and ID them and got very involved in it. The funny part was that she told her sister-in-law that she'd help be the naturalist on the boat. She'd help the naturalist. And so her friend told her friend who was from England, and she goes, how can you be a naturalist in Alaska?
Oh, she got nudist.
Yeah,
Because I
a
got that
naturalist
all the
in England is a nudist.
That's a good one. It must be cold. On that note, let's move to how do we help people either, I mean, there's a lot of ways that we all know to help have them gain more knowledge. But what is that relationship like? Like, for instance, we mentioned sometimes people don't have the correct information. But how do we help people know something or gain knowledge in our experiences?
So what I do at the start of everything that I do is I ask people to wonder. And I say, and it's okay to sit with that wonder for a moment. You might, like, we're in this digital age where I don't have to wonder long because I'll hop on my phone and find the answer really quick. But take the wonder, and the way that I explain it is it makes a crack in your brain, and then that's that open space. And then when you find the answer to your wonder, whether it's in 20 seconds when I get to that stop on my tour, just be patient, I will answer it, or if it's late years down the line, you've got a place for that knowledge and it'll help you remember it for that much longer. And so with kids, like they're like, yeah. So when I'm gonna do a topic, I say, what do you wonder? Like, what do you wonder about the tour we're about to take, or about this workshop we're about to do, or like, what do you wonder? And I'll call on a couple people and I'll go, okay, I wonder if we'll cover those, you know, and then we kind of move on and just kind of allowing their brains to have that discomfort of not knowing something yet, and giving them the grace to say that that's okay. It works really well.
Good technique.
So what we do with the kids is if we're on a walk and we have our field guides with us, then when they ask what something is, say like, well, let's figure this out together. And that also kind of gives them a sense of empowerment, like, oh, I don't have to be reliant on somebody. I can figure this out, and then it teaches them to use their resources too.
Well, it also gets away from what is it, and,
Yes.
and you always have the answer, and so that becomes just a pointing effort after.
Yeah.
A lot of times if I'm doing the tours for the salmon hatchery, people ask a question, because I don't work in the hatchery, so there's a lot of stuff going on I don't know. If one of the staff is walking around, I'll flag them down, and I'll be like, help me answer this question, or I'll be like, hey, I have a question for you. Doesn't always happen because they're busy and sometimes I don't see them, but I will usually tell that guest, I'm not real sure, let me find a hatchery person, and I'll find out, and then I will, when we're in the aquarium and they're just milling, I'll go find somebody and get the answer to that question for them. But I'm not sure if my coworkers appreciate it or not, but I'll put them on the spot all the time. Just be like, hey, I have a question, come here, and usually they're pretty good about helping me answer it because they know I don't know everything that they're doing. And so usually that, I think, the guests appreciate that I'm not just going to blow them off, or I'm not just going to say, hey, I'm not real sure, or make up an answer. That I'll be like, oh, here's an expert, let me ask this person, because I'm not the expert, and I usually will tell them that.
Well, it
So
also
don't do that.
demonstrates that learning process if you don't
Yeah.
know what are the resources that are there to find out more information.
Yeah.
Anything else for this category?
I noticed in the workbook here it says wanting to know about the meaning of things, events, and symbols. And I have the experience being on a kayak tour guide assistant, and I don't think this really fits perfectly with this hierarchy because the guide actually had a lot of inaccurate information that he was telling to our guests, and I knew that it was incorrect, but I didn't really want to usurp his or upset his authority, and I just made a note and would try to steer the guests when I had a moment for the correct answer. Like one time he told people this wild cucumber was edible, and I knew it was actually poisonous, those spiky ones. And he had really inaccurate stuff that he reported as factual, so I noticed like that was a kind of a strange way to operate, and I don't know how I guess I would ask you guys what you would do in that situation.
Good question.
I know that I've had similar situations where one of the other crew members was talking to a guest and sharing is inaccurate information. And I've had to just say, the updated information, but
Yeah.
sometimes if you can't do it and embarrass the crew member, you have to say, I just noticed you said that, and I've been reading up on that, and the new updated information is this, and hope that they pass it on. Unless it's poisonous or something, and that might be something you tell that guide right away so that they can go back and correct themselves. And hopefully they'll go back and say, I thought that was a certain other plan, however they handle it. But I think that if it's not endangering, most of that information is going to go out the window with the person, and it's not important. But something that's poisonous, like I don't ever pick a fungi and let people try it because I may be wrong. I just say, this is what I think it is. And yes, it's used for this certain thing, but I'm not going to put anybody in danger of, that's safe to eat. So
There was just a plant growing along
Yeah, I
the
know
shore
which
that
one
he
you're
pointed
talking
out, and he was like, that's a wild cucumber or something.
Any other advice for Jessica?
I would say just putting out like a general kind of warning. It was like, well, hey, you can take his word for it, but if I were you, I would double check before you did it. Like do your own research and kind of put that blanket statement and go, hey, are you really gonna trust? You need to put it on yourself. Are you gonna trust me? Or am I maybe made a mistake there? But kind of putting it on them, like
hey, double check everything before. For your own peace of mind.
Any other advice? It's a challenging situation, both as a supervisor or a boss kind of thing, as well as, you know, if you're a guest in that experience and you know that that's not the case. But hard issue to deal with for sure.
Well, I think as somebody, because I do supervise staff underneath me, and if I hear them, I'll never correct them in front of guests. I just think that that's completely undermining the authority they have with the tour or guests or something like that. So if I hear them give misinformation, I'll pull them and say, hey, I heard you say this earlier, just kind of what you said, just so you know, that's not actually factual, or, you know, this is how it should be said. Or one thing we get a lot, and this is everybody, is the sea star starfish thing. You know, we're trying to, the technical term should be sea stars, they're not a fish. So we try to move away from that. But you don't correct people. I've learned that. I did it first when I first started getting into this, and I was like, no, it's a sea star, it's a sea star. And I'm like, you can't correct them. Just say, I will still call it a sea star. If they call it a starfish, I'm gonna say sea star back. I'm not gonna say, well, you know, it's supposed to be sea star. So it's that, don't ever correct people in that regard where they're gonna feel like you're judging them or putting them down. You just have to keep doing what you're supposed to do, and hopefully they'll hear it and start questioning and be like, oh, because I've had people say, well, what do you mean sea star? What's a sea star? Well, it's a starfish, but it's not really a fish, so we've moved away from that term, and I've started calling it a sea star. And they're like, oh, I didn't know that. Most people, they're what's the term that's been used forever, so that's what they call them. So, you know, things like that. So sometimes you have to, it is a fine balance of how that you can correct without them taking it a negative way, so especially with guests.
That is so true. It's all about saving face for everybody. And in what I do, we have, and I'll describe them for you because it's usually a guy, sorry. And he wants to stump the tour guide because he wants to do the tour. I'm so sorry, guys, to say this, but it's usually a guy, especially if it's a woman that's giving the tour. So it's just saving face for everybody. And I try to, you know, massage their ego and say, oh, you know so much. And I even tease them. I'll hand them the microphone. Okay, why don't you, you know. And sometimes they will, you know, they'll give their knowledge and
I get it with,
face.
yeah, I get it with fishermen sometimes. The commercial fishermen come in, and I'm just a girl, and what do I know? And I'm like, okay, maybe I don't fish, but I know the fish. So I'm just like, but yeah, so same thing.
Or in this case, not the fish.
Yeah, or in this case, not the fish.
I think it depends on the relationship you have with the person too. Like if you happen to be an interpreter like on a tour, but you don't necessarily know the person, something that's really effective for me as like what my supervisor does for me is he's really good about, well, where did you find that information? Because he knows that I respect his input so much that if I can't recall it immediately, whether or not I do it in front of him or not, I'm going to do more research so that I further my base of knowledge, so that, and it's also a teaching or a learning opportunity for him too, because there's some things that we just don't know, or there's more things that we're passionate about. Like we all have our own little, you know, niche within the department. So there are certain things like, specifically for me, my stuff is weaving and medicine, so different types of plants and what they can do. But he does a lot of carving, and he's our archaeologist, and so there are different things that we are just separately passionate about. So we learn from each other, but at the same time, like he's very good about like, well, where did you learn, you know, that information, so that I can speak to the knowledge that I have, and then he can also question sometimes the resource.
Yeah, yeah. You know, if you're supervising people, we've brought this up several different places. There's a great new course online on coaching, interpretive coaching in situations, and the whole aspect of how to give feedback in an appropriate way, in a way that acknowledges who they are, but that sense of correcting information. And I can either get you information. Actually, if you go into the training page of NAI, the NAI website, interprenet.com, it'll be listed in there, and it's offered as an online course. So how do we help visitors to understand that big picture? Because sometimes they're coming in and they have little bits and pieces, or maybe they have none whatsoever at all. They've never been in this situation that way. How do we help them to understand all the things that are happening, the connections that are there?
through story. Sometimes personal story introduce how you started to see the connection can help.
So give us an example of.
Actually, it's one of the things I'm going to do for my presentation.
Oh, good.
Sometimes it's introducing how you got interested in something, and then and like you wondered about a question about why something was that way, and then you started to get more information about it, and you realized the connections between them, you know, it comes into the whole.
Okay. How do we check for understanding this person? Let them understand something.
Sometimes they just agree. They go, oh, now I get it. I see the connections. I know for myself, there's times that you don't. There's things that like everybody else knows. For me, like when I started working as a naturalist and learning things, I knew that there were lines, but I didn't really know what they were. And all of a sudden, when I got to know what they were, I became deeply interested in them. And I think that that's what you start seeing in people when you start starting the connections. I do get them for longer periods of time. So then they start questioning you more about whatever it is that you talked about, and they start responding to that.
Well, and as those questions come up, you begin to realize, okay, they don't get that part, but they get this. So it's almost like a reflection of for them. Yeah.
So reflections to what you talked about in the story.
Ask open-ended questions.
Okay. But give us an example of an open-ended question. I'm going to put you on the spot.
So if I've just talked to kids about the life cycle of an animal or something, instead of just being like, does that make sense? Ask them something that is related that would see, can they apply it in a different situation, or can they extend beyond this to the next step? Because if they've integrated what we've talked about, they should have functional knowledge they can use to do those tasks.
Okay, great. Michelle?
So we will get asked the same question over and over and over again with new groups of children as they come in, and I will have just finished explaining to one child, and the other child will be like, well, what's this? And I'll be like, you just learned that. Can you explain that to them? And it kind of works with the esteem as well, because they get to share the knowledge they learn, but it also gives me feedback of, okay, did they understand what I told them? Oh, maybe not. Okay, gonna revisit that. Usually they get it.
And then if that's the case, you can intervene and figure it out.
Exactly. It's really fun.
I have no experience in most of these things, so I'm talking out of a knowledge base that I don't have. But for me, what always worked well is to visualize things. It's kind of the USA Today of interpretation, right? It's either a horrible article or a colorful graph that has a meaningless description, but it allows you how to see it's just like 50,000 ships full of grain, rather than it's 40 million pounds of grain, right? Where we can kind of visualize these things and then smear that into the presentation that you have. And identify what they can conceive.
And use that in units of things that they might have.
Yes.
A good example of that is when we would do a lot of beach walks on Puget Sound. I managed a program for King County Parks where we did a classroom presentation on the intertidal zones, and then come to the shores of Puget Sound. Is talking about the depth of Puget Sound based on how many space needles it was. Because even if you haven't been to the Space Needle, but you live in the area, you get a sense of how tall it is. And rather than saying whatever, how many feet it's tall. And then it would be like, whoa, that's really deep, or whatever it might be. So.
Sometimes I'll ask people how they feel about something, or like, instead of being like, do you have any questions? I'm like, well, how does that feel to you? Because sometimes I used to volunteer at Wolf Haven, and so sometimes I might say something that would be the opposite of something that someone might think about a wolf. Instead of being like, well, do you have questions about that? Be like, well, how does that make you feel, or how are you sitting with that? Because I think that can kind of spark more questions. Like, well, I actually thought this about wolves, or I heard this, and then they can kind of, bring more conversation or kind of learning into the group.
Well, and feel is a different word than know. And so it gives more room for asking other things they might not.
Right.
Yeah. Neat.
Yeah, to piggyback on that, instead of saying, really know about, well, what did you learn, saying, so now that you've seen blah, 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 whatever it was, what are some of your thoughts? Because we realized with our feedback, we were asking people to just give back facts that may not really lead to any change in the future, but if we kind of ask them, so what are you thinking now that you've seen this, whatever they saw? And again, there's no right or wrong,
Exactly.
but we hope that we're provoking them to want to know more.
Well, and the valuable part of it too is that sense of evaluation. You, in your own head, you can start to say, how did, especially if you're doing it near an end of the presentation, you begin to realize, oh yeah, they're getting it, yeah, those pieces, now that one's missing, I'm gonna bring up that quick process in your mind, or, ooh, I gotta do it differently next time, if the other factor comes into play. Let's move up to the next level. Now, aesthetic, now this may seem kind of an odd category here, but I think part of it is thinking about how do we help visitors appreciate the aesthetics of something.
So what we do with the walks is, so we have every fourth grader from the North Thurston Public School District, every first grader, coming here in the fall.
Wow.
And we have about 45 minutes for a walk. And while the inside loop is only a mile, we usually only end up doing about a quarter of it, because when it's nice and warm in the fall, you could easily see over 100 woolly bear caterpillars, or over 100 little Pacific tree frogs. And so
And it's all new to them. Everyone is new to them.
well, yeah, exactly. So whenever they see a caterpillar or a frog, they're going to stop and they're going to look and they're going to count each one and they're going to sit and watch it for a little bit. And we're not going to discourage that because that's what excites them about the natural world. And so just letting each kid kind of find their own niche. And if a group wants to go a little bit faster, maybe they'll get a little bit further. But if you're with a group who's really excited about the woolly bear caterpillars, then just sit and watch the woolly bears.
Neat. Because there is that sense, all of us have that sense of a goal in mind, you know.
Yeah.
We're still going 1 mile, 2 miles, whatever it might be, finish the loop, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
That's it. It's a good story.
I will often play on eagles with people. Like if I'll see them like the eagle soaring, and I'm not really a birder, but I love bald eagles. And a lot of people, especially from the lower 48, you don't see bald eagles very often, and they don't recognize that that's an eagle flying overhead. So if I spot one, I will completely stop in the middle of my tour and say, "Oh, look, an eagle!" And most of them will be like, "Oh my gosh," because they didn't see it. And so yeah, I'm talking about salmon and hatcheries and fish, but if there's something that I think is really neat, or sometimes we get the great blue heron as well. There's a couple that live real close to our hatchery, and I'll point out, "Oh look, there's our heron buddy out there." You know, I'll try to point those things out that are not my field of expertise at all. But if I recognize it, and I know people will be into that, especially if it's outdoorsy wildlife stuff. So sometimes we'll get eagles that sit we have pylons outside of our facility, and they'll just be sitting up there. And so I'll point them out. If I see them, hey, if we will approach real slowly, you might be able to get a little bit closer image of these eagles or whatever. And people, they seem to really appreciate that I'm not just so focused on the hatchery and the fish, and I'm willing to point out what other stuff is happening around.
Well, it's those interpretive moments that you
Yeah.
have to take advantage of, because otherwise they're just still going to pay attention to something that you didn't want them to, so to speak.
Or the sound they make too. People don't realize, because you hear them all the time. They don't realize the chattering noise, and that's an eagle. They'll be like, "Oh, that's you as you're hearing an eagle right now." And they, "What do you mean?" Well, that's the noise they make. They don't screech. That's that chattering at each other noise.
Yeah, it's always the movie, the
Yeah, not the red tail hawk screech. No, that's not it. Yeah.
Other.
I want to suggest, and that's the use of silence. So often we fill a talk with our conversation and they fill the walk or the experience with their own chit chat with each other. And what I've done just repeatedly is to say, often not at the beginning of a walk, but right in the middle or toward the end, let's just all take just 2 minutes of silence, just to take it in. And notice what you will, but let's just be silent for 2 minutes. For many people, 2 minutes is a total eternity of quiet. And I often say, listen to what's close, try to listen to what's beyond close, and then listen to the larger environment behind. And for many people, it's quite moving, because they're really tuning into their senses and the larger kind of gestalt of the the place, wherever it is. And they often notice things that they haven't noticed. Or they just say, wow, this place is so special. So you know that some little aesthetic axon in there is sending a message about beauty.
That brings up a good point too, in the sense that interpretive styles, leadership styles, sometimes it can be that person just keeps going on and on and on and doesn't even acknowledge, doesn't even read the group, or it's just that sharing of information, and that's actually a nice technique to be able to kind of even ground.
And sometimes it takes confidence to do that. You know, where I work, we have a 26-page script, but once you have time on the water, and I'm getting so much out of this, you know, how can I incorporate more silences or wait time, because I got that from you guys yesterday, within my speech, but also keep within the time I have to do my work.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's something I'm gonna work on, yeah.
I know that I use silence in 2 different episodes. When we're in the kayak and we're in British Columbia and we've gone along and we've talked about time and how there's a timelessness that you feel when you're on the water, and that's how people live their lives in the area. They didn't think of time the same way we did. And, you know, for thousands of years this has happened, and you go in there and just be silent and experience the timelessness of this place. And another was, we go walk through a forest and I happen to sit on the mosses and lay back. And sometimes there's a teaching moment to see how many different lichens or mosses you can find. Because when you see everything's green, you don't think about it, but taking the time to just kind of sit there and look. Or, like you say, to sit back, close your eyes, and listen to the sound of whatever birds. Let's see how many bird sounds, or what sounds do you hear when you're doing that. And then talk about it a little bit and share about it. But I found that silence and fitting in just as your time period, make that part of it. Make it 3 minutes or 2 minutes of your time period, so that it's not just in, I have a little bit, well, some of the things are time in our situations, but trying to bring that into part of it.
Great.
Yeah, Shannon kind of hit on it there, and then often we're like, look at this, but closing your eyes can be really just that much more impactful. I remember, this is just a personal experience, but I went to Niagara Falls when my friend and I, we actually just sat with our back to the falls and just listened, and that still stays with me very vividly, you know, rather than even just like looking at the falls. I can still remember like the roar behind me.
Yeah.
I think sharing your personal experiences, like when you had an aha moment, or when you just had a moment of revelation, and using the words that you felt personally. Maybe the first time you encountered something and where you were at, and you know, just that helps them to again connect with you, but then also see there's more than just the facts and the figures.
Definitely.
You could do it as a call to action too, at kind of like any point of the tour or the program. So depending on like the audience, so I work a lot with educators as well, and we're all incredibly busy. So like even at the beginning, I invite everybody to just kind of like breathe together, like you know, set your intentions for the day, what, you know, and then you can come back to that later on. Like, okay, so, and invite them, you know, in this moment, I, you know, invite you all to really be present. So let's take a minute, and then I'd like to know how you guys are feeling. You know what I mean? So that it's not, and then it also gives space for not only the feelings, but then to also, you know, take care of the other needs. Like, you know, do we need a break? Do we need, you know, I mean, are we full? Do we need a moment to just really have a moment, you know, to ourselves? Do we need to use the restrooms? What kind of space and time do we need right now?
Great advice. So with this, the idea, the concept that you can see in the book there, in terms of self-actualization, is a pretty big word, trying to figure out what that means. What I like to think of this as, changing this to peak experiences. What are the things that we will cover before you can have a peak experience? And not that every visitor experience and encounter is going to be peak, but there's pieces of it that can be that way. And those opportunities when people can have that change of life, people change their profession sometimes based on what the experiences you've had. Or they'll be talking about it, many people in terms of when they travel and they retire and then they get older and infirm and they can't travel any longer, the albums, the videos, whatever, that reliving of experiences. But these are the aspects of, you know, literally covering kinds of these elements before we can have a peak experience. And it's something good for us to think about with designing and developing visitor experiences to ensure that these are in place. We've gotten a lot of really good advice from the group. One thing I wanted, actually, any more questions or comments about this concept?
I have a question just where something would fit on here, because I was thinking about, like, when I give, like, tours or give presentations, sometimes in order for people to feel comfortable, they kind of want to have, like, an agenda, or they want to know, like, the time, like, okay, for, like, the next hour, we're going to be doing this, and these are the things I'm going to be covering. Because I know sometimes when people don't have that, like, mindset or that framework, they kind of get a little bit antsy, and they don't know where we're going, or how long we're going to be doing stuff for, so, like, I'm just curious where that would fit in here.
So let me throw that out to the group. Where would you think that would fit?
At the first one, it's physiological. In a sense, you're addressing that neediness of wanting to have control over a situation.
Or some kind of structure?
Yeah, some kind of structure.
And possibly even here.
Yeah.
Have others experienced that with visitors?
Yes. Yes.
Depends on the audience. The more educated, whenever I work with educators, they're like, what's next? You know what I mean? Like, I don't, it's really hard, and that's why I'm intentional about slowing things down, but they really want to know, and I'm very good about not putting times. Like, even if you do an agenda, you can do it kind of the order that you want to go in, or you can even set it in like goals for the day, but I don't assign a time to it, because like, you know, this whole homogenous empty time, they're like, well, what's next? Like, well, okay, well, we're doing this, and it's like, okay, no, like, be here with me, and then we'll move forward.
It's kind of funny where I work because we're in a visitor center across the runway from the factory itself. So we have people coming in as we work in our theater. They're showing the film first. They go, "Are they going on a bus?" Yeah, we're going to see where the airplanes are built. You're not going to fly over? No, we're not going to fly over. So yeah, they need to know. You need to tell them exactly what we're going to do.
So, personally, for me, it's the other way around. I need to know the timing of it, because when the buses drop them off, I need to know what time they need to be back on the bus, so that I'm watching the time and know, okay, I've got 10 minutes. I got to make sure that I'm wrapping it up, that I give them time for the gift shop and those kinds of things. They are usually, like, the bus driver will tell them. They're all really good about telling them, okay, be back at the bus at this time, so they know. I usually don't know, and I'm usually like, okay, what time do you guys all think to be back on the bus? And you know, usually it's not something we really worry about or stress about, but. There's only once or twice where people get a little panicked, like, oh my gosh, I don't know where I need to be.
Well, and that's the culture of those tour groups. That's
Yes.
one of the kinds of things I'm sure you've run into that.
Yeah.
That sense, and especially that feel that I'm going to get left behind. I mean,
Yes.
that's like the big.
And I always tell them, I'm like, are we your last stop? And they said, yeah, we're done after you. I'm like, oh, well, it's only a 5-minute walk to the harbor. You guys are fine. I'm like, if you miss the bus, we'll get you there. Don't worry, you know. But there's that, you know, we try to make sure that we understand. We'll get you back to the bus. I just need to know, you know, for me personally, the timing.
I was just gonna say, I really like your approach, Nicole, and I was gonna say, probably there's some people else wondering what Ben's thoughts were in relation to time and having to have more constraints, but.
Yeah, and I would just say, just to add to that, like, you guys have all said it before, but just setting the expectations, let people know what they're gonna do, like what you did this morning. You walked us through, yesterday you walked us through the week, this morning you walked us through the day. We can already in our minds start to anticipate what's gonna happen, we know what we need to do, and we're better prepared. Just prepares the audience.
Okay.
for that.
So one of the things that I strongly encourage you to do with the outline, we're going to start launching the outline here shortly, is one of the things we'd like in the introduction part, there's introduction, body, and conclusion section of the outline, is, you know, you'll be introducing yourself, what agency or organization you're with, and then just putting the words Maslow's needs, meaning that these kinds of things you've thought about. The restrooms are over there. I mean, we've given all those kinds of things at the beginning of a talk or a presentation. And that's when we say Maslow's needs, meaning, you know, all this kind of thing, in the sense that those needs are addressed by you. Actually, and you don't have to necessarily write out everything you'd say, but that is a catch-all kind of phrase on the outline that will be useful that way. So underneath every chair is a little sheet of paper with a tape on it. And what I'd like you to do, hopefully, I think I covered every, actually, you know what, I might have done this because everybody switched around. If you don't have one, there's probably one under here.
$100? Thank you.
So, what I'd like you to do, what we're gonna do here in a second is I'm gonna have whoever goes first, you can stand up and read it, and then bring it over and tape it up to where you think what category this might rest in. And then if it's a little bit of a question or dilemma or whatever, how would you address that as the leader of that interpretive experience? And these cover a real broad gamut. So it could be something like an equalage, it could be something like a walk, it could be, and I tried really hard to make sure it wasn't just natural history. So that's important to me and to others in this room. So who would like to go first? Actually, let me give you a minute or two to read it and think about it. We'll get some of you at home ready.
Me too, we're ready.
Okay. No, you guys can start.
Yeah, so I'll go
Okay.
too.
Mine is, I love the smell of coffee. So I would put this on an aesthetic. Don't know if there's a right answer.
So I want to learn how to make ceramics, so I would need to be in knowledge, right?
I cannot find my kid. Safety and security. And I was just thinking about, depending on where you are, because it's happened to me with kids, is sometimes when you're in a situation where there's room for people to kind of go, you might identify a place where you go to if you get lost. And say, hey, if you get lost, go to this spot. That happened with my own child when he was 5. He tended to take off and disappear, and I gave him to some friends that were taking to an air show. And I said, the first thing you need to tell him is where to go if something happens. And they did, and he got lost. He got separated with 45,000 people.
Oh, gosh.
And they spent an hour looking for him, but the first place they didn't look was where he was supposed to go when he was safe, and that's where he was.
Wow.
So I think that's one of the ways you can do it, and I think you need to maybe have to settle that person. You might have somebody else help look, or you have everyone sit down and look around and see where that child was. Because that's very important to a mom.
I bet.
All right, are we going to see a seal? Well, it depends if we're going to go to the buffet or not. Oh! Actually, I say that fits with love and belonging, because something like, are we going to go see a seal, is somebody's desire to want to see a seal, right? And when you start off with, these are the things we're going to go see, and this is what hopefully we'll do.
Okay.
Nice.
That's where I think it sits.
Sure.
Mhm.
Somebody else?
Where's the restroom or bathroom? Got an easy one.
Aesthetic is what I mean.
Just wanted to admire the architecture, right?
Someone else?
Mine is, what are we having for dinner tonight? So, put that down here.
Typically asked exactly 2 minutes after the child finishes lunch.
Yes. I want to see a bat. Are we going to see one? The way that I would address this and where I put this is at esteem and knowledge, because here's an opportunity to acknowledge maybe what they know about bats, or to also be like a call to action. I think we will see it today. Will you keep an eye out for me in case I miss it? So that's where I put mine.
I have the same one, and I'm just going to agree.
Oh,
I really was struggling with that one. I was going to say knowledge, but that's even better. Thank you.
Oh, well.
Okay, you have to do the turn trying to do that.
Mine was, I've seen woodpeckers before, I want to see something else. So I put that in knowledge because they already have knowledge about woodpeckers, so let's all wander together and see what else we can find.
I can go. Do you like being a guide? And I would put that in belonging. As a point of connection. You can talk about what you like about it, what you don't. Ask for commonalities between the group. Have they ever had an opportunity to guide?
If
So where'd you put yours?
I stuck it in London Law.
Okay, I'm gonna do like being a guide. I'm gonna agree with that, but I'm also gonna say I think you could use it as a jump board to get towards understanding like your relationship to the resource and why it's important. See, you don't have to do the exact same thing.
So I'm tired of always being last in line, so I'm going to put that in belonging, because it seems like they're not feeling like they're part of a group, they're feeling a little bit left behind maybe.
So I have been struggling with this. Boy, this place is really old and boring, looking around a historical house. I would say between knowledge and understanding, because it's a teaching opportunity of why it's a neat house, and then you can hopefully connect it to a greater area.
I'm really wet. So under physiological.
You've been on my tours.
I'm tired of always being last in line, and I'm gonna put it under esteem, because eventually that person just kind of stops participating.
Good point.
Do you have a native name? First I was thinking it goes into, well, I'll need it, but.
Could you say that a little louder, Jessica, so everyone can hear?
It says, do you have a native name? And first I was gonna say, of course it belongs here, but I think it might be an opportunity to have some understanding over that particular question. I don't know what motivates them to ask. Maybe that, if I were their guide, I would prefer to start that into a conversation, because I'm not native here, so I'm not sure how I would respond to that question, but.
May I ask, because we do try to get a person here, how would you answer that, or how would you?
So it depends, for me it depends on the audience. Like, I mean, if it's a kid asking me, like, it's a different conversation than an adult who should know better. Because there are different things. Like, so I'll just share, like, when I talk to kids, we talk about traditional life ways. So, we talk about potlatches and naming ceremonies. So then that's typically when the question will come up. Well, what do you have for name? And then I'll talk about my name and where it came from. And that's one thing, but it also, it depends on the audience. Like, if there are people like, well, and it's typically not as polite. It's like, what's your Indian name? So, I don't know. I wouldn't encourage you to even ask that question unless it's appropriate. Like, it's appropriate when I'm talking about traditional life ways and naming ceremonies, but if you just want to, it's intimate, so I can explain that to adults. Like, it's one of those things where it's not just, because it's a novelty item for you, but it's deeply intimate for me. So it's not something that I'm going to share with you, but I'll share it with a fourth grader who's asked what happened at my naming ceremony.
And this question, I use this question because in Alaska, when I was managing a visitor center, one of our employees was at the desk, and to the typical, we had a lot of cruise ship passengers come in, even though we were in Fairbanks, miles away, but they were part of groups that way. And it was their first encounter with someone who was Native Alaskan. And it was a struggle all summer long, because she would get these kinds of questions that to her were incredibly rude. But the visitor didn't understand that. And how in those few minutes interchange can you help them understand that that's not what you do? And so it was a real dilemma for all of us, because we were helping her to deal with that stress, so to speak.
I'm kind of glad I got that one, because I've been, remember going to camp, and that was a guided thing for Pick your students. name. Yeah, to select a new name.
Oh.
I don't know if that's still something that occurs for kids, but
Still happens every day.
And
Also,
I-
even Boy Scouts, it's native lore, like the badge that they get is native lore. Actually, no, it's not, it's Indian lore.
for
It's a
an
badge-
actual
a
Boy Scout
that they
badge.
earn, yeah.
But it made me think of a time that I have accidentally or without knowing realize there's a time and place to just be present, but not to have to understand, or it's not my place to understand.
Which is really hard for Westerners.
Yeah.
I was wondering, like, so, and that was really helpful too, again, what you said there, Jessica. So it depends on the context, particularly, like, if it's the subject material is kind of arisen, like it's all right, you know, or if like it's a more personal conversation, not like as a part of it, like a tour or something.
Yeah.
So is that right?
Yeah, well, it's just like, appropriate or inappropriate questions. You know what I mean? It has to do with like the timing.
Yeah.
Like, are you asking just because of a selfish reason, or are you asking to deepen your knowledge about something? So the same example, if I'm talking about traditional lifeways and I'm talking about gathering cedar, and I'll get the question, do you gather cedar? Yes, I did. We do it. I do it every year. These are the things that we do. These are the processes that we go through. Or like, do I hunt, or are there these other things? You know what I mean? Like, it's a different than finding the token Indian in the room and being like, oh, like, do you still do traditional things, or is it in a conversation in a setting that's appropriate? It's just like inappropriate questions at in any other sort of program. Yeah.
Others do. Okay.
So this is in looking at pointing to an abstract painting in some museum or whatever. I could paint that. And I'd say, oh, well, then you should. You should endeavor to become an abstract painter. Maybe you could be in the museum too, because at least they're appreciating it.
Mine says that music is so challenging to listen to, it hurts my ears. I'm taking that as it's really loud, and so it's like uncomfortable to listen to. So I would say it's kind of between the first and second one, because physically it might be hurting your ears and then making you uncomfortable.
Will you read it one more time?
That music is so challenging to listen to, it hurts my ears. Because to me, like, if your ears are hurting with the music, it must be from being too loud and not like physically hurting your eardrums.
Okay. Any others?
The easy one, I think. When are we going to be back at the parking lot? Zoological.
Well, this is great. One thing for us to consider, and I like this kind of an idea, is the sense that if we are meeting these at different levels in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we can actually invert the triangle. And on your workbook, on the left-hand side, left hand of this photograph, is that concept that we can actually have more time for peak experiences and better interpretive experiences if we can meet these needs and provide an amazing visitor experience.
Can I add one more thing?
What's that?
Could I add one more thing? I'd just like to add one more thing about Maslow himself. He laid these needs out, but he did not make the hierarchy. I don't think it's even known who made the hierarchy, but with college students in psych classes, they always say Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Have you heard that expression? Mm-hmm. As if to say, you can't self-actualize until you've met everything below it. Maslow never postulated that. And I think that one thing we should be aware of is the very basic needs at the bottom really are terribly essential. But all the other things around belonging and intellectual stimulation and aesthetics all kind of are in a jumble together. And we're all kind of growing and developing around those needs all of our lives. So I think, I just don't want you to walk away with the assumption is people really have to have a sense of belongingness and love and connection, or they'll never self-actualize. I mean, I think a lot of claims get made around this hierarchy as if it's you do step 1 and then you do step 2 and then you do step 3. Not necessarily so. A lot of developmental theories sort of are phases, but all are kind of in play all the time. But I think for us as interpreters, those very basic ones are really, really so essential for people to feel comfortable and safe. So
too, especially in terms of the hierarchy, it's typically talked about in terms of learning. I wish Bryce was here today because he talks about, how do you talk about recycling when you're speaking to a population, a marginalized population that, has to worry about surviving every day. So it's the same thing like within a classroom. Like you can't teach a child long division unless you've met certain needs within the classroom, and that's where a lot of the issues are in our education system today. So while it might not be the same within the programs that you guys are all, interpreters for, but when it comes to, we talked about, the myelin sheath and the axon and all of those things, but there are different pieces to learning that affect that, like stress, so like your cortisol levels, that affect the learning